Hello, my name is Nikolai Steiner. Welcome to this introduction to note taking. Note taking is a complex process which involves number of considerations. First of all, you need to consider why you even take the notes in the first place. Then you need to consider how to take good notes. And as notes very quickly become plenty, you also need to consider how to organize your notes. This involves also what different kinds of notes you take and how you use them. And ultimately how these notes will be operational in your writing process. Enjoy. This presentation has six main sections. First, I will address a couple of questions. Why do I take notes? How do I take notes? Then I will discuss different kinds of notes. I will try to explain how to organize your notes. Then I will give an example of a particular software which is useful when organizing notes. And finally, I will discuss how to use your notes. But before we start, I want to emphasize quite strongly, when dealing with academic writing or critical thinking, there is no reason to read a text if you do not take notes. So do take notes. Notes essentially is all you got once you've read your text. So, why do I take notes? Well, many people think that you take notes in order to log what someone wrote or said. Say you're at a lecture, you take down notes of whatever the lecturer says, you read a text and you try to summarize what's in the text. And in a way, that's not altogether wrong, but it's not altogether right either. Because you really need to ask yourself, how would this note be useful to my future self? Because the idea of taking notes is not just taking them and leaving them in your notebook. The idea, of course, is that you want to use them at some later point in your life. This later point in your life may be tomorrow, next week, or it may be months or even years from now. So therefore, it's quite important to consider where these notes should actually go. And here you must consider the context. Where would this note be useful to me? Maybe it's useful at the examination, obviously, but it may also be useful for a paper assignment that you've got. And not just the one you got just now, maybe the next or one next year or several years from now, because that's how you make the best of your notes. Therefore, remember that your reason for reading a text is different from the author's reason for writing it. This is maybe quite obvious, but you may not always think about it, because when you're eager to make a trustworthy account of what's in a text, you may forget why you read the text in the first place. And you typically read for a reason. You typically read in order to find out something about a specific topic, which is the topic of your paper, typically. And therefore, you must always have in the back of your head why you read the text, not just why the author wrote it. Therefore, you should consider why you think that the text is relevant to you specifically. As an example, you may want to write a critical essay about, say, sustainable architecture. And maybe you have some texts about all the virtues of sustainable architecture, because the authors think that it's a really good thing, but you want to put a critical perspective onto sustainable architecture, and you may want to discuss what are some of the negative things about it, because obviously there must be some. And this may not be the author's intent for writing the text, obviously, but it may be your intent for reading it. So, how do you then take notes? Well, in the process, you have limited time. So therefore, you should take quick notes, and you should do it in pen and paper. Many people think, well, if I write pen and paper notes, then I would just have piles of notebooks or even loose sheets of paper, maybe in folders. So I want to just key my notes in on the computer once and for all in the process of taking my notes. That is not a good idea. And there's a number of reasons. But first, as you should take quick notes with pen and paper, this obviously means that you should always carry your pen and notebook with you, because you never know when you will need to take down important information. Because things you want to take notes about don't necessarily come in planned situations like in a lecture or when reading a book. It may also stem from a conversation at the lunch table, or because you're taking a walk in the forest and you are contemplating your topic and then suddenly some ideas come to you. Then you should be able to take down a note. So always carry a notebook and a pen with you. So what is what? You should distinguish between summaries, quotes, and reflections when you take notes. When you read, you want to give an account of what's in the text, and sometimes you may think that this particular sentence or section is so well written and so to the point for my topic, I want to actually quote the author. And then in your note, it should be clear to you afterwards that, well, this is not my personal summary of what's in the text. This is the actual text, or at least a part of it, namely a quote. And also, your considerations about the text, which may not be what is in the text, should also be in a separate part in your note. There are different styles of note-taking. And one which I will be explaining or showing here is the Cornell style. It's quite widespread. It's actually developed in the 1950s for students for taking down notes in lectures, but it can be applied to many different situations. What is also important, and what is one of the main reasons why you should not use your computer to take down your quick notes, is that after reading, you must always review your notes. Why is that? Well, the thing is, when you take down the note, you're typically in a hurry. Either because the lecturer keeps talking all the time, or because if you intercept your reading flow when reading a text and taking notes too often or too much for taking notes, then you kind of lose your flow. So you want to also have or develop a very compacted style of taking down notes while you read. And obviously, on a very practical level, if you read a text either in print from a book or journal or on the screen, and you want to take a note on a computer, you need to move your eyes from the text you're reading over to the computer screen, and you need to coordinate your hands on the keyboard with what you see on the screen, and then you want to return to your text. And this is a radical shift of attention. Of course, if you take notes in pen and paper, you also need to move your eyes. But as the pen is right where you're looking, and as you can you can doodle all kinds of abbreviations and marks and symbols, which may mean something to you, you may more easily develop a fast and efficient way of taking notes. Also, as many people typically find themselves being faster in typing than in writing by hand, this is actually an argument for writing by hand, because if you have less time because you're slower writing with a pen, this means that you need to reflect more on what you're reading or what you're hearing in the lecture in order to give a more condensed summary. So you rephrase what the lecturer says or what is written in the text in your own words. And this is a far better technique in order to remember, because you need to formulate things in your own wording. So, also, you must remember that once you've read the text or left the auditorium after the lecture, the notes is all you got. Because you may not have the books available at the time of writing. Either you have misplaced them, you've returned them to the library, or someone else borrowed them, or you're in a different place than where your books are, whatever. Also, consider that if you need to consult the book again, then why did you actually take the notes in the first place? Really, taking notes should be done once and for all, because you take the notes in order to keep the information that you think is important from the text, and then you should leave the text, because then in the ideal world, of course, there's nothing more in the text for you to be interested in, because you already took it down in the notes. Of course, there can be exceptions. If you're completely new to a topic, you may have to consult books that you started out reading, because at that point you didn't really understand much. So once you've read some more texts, or you've gathered more information about your topic, and you reread some of your very first texts, then you may actually get a better understanding of what's in the text. But really, this is typically a matter of starting out with the wrong texts. If you start out with too difficult texts, then you won't understand much. So start out with more easy texts, encyclopedia definitions, or texts in books for general audiences, describing the topic in plain words. So, also you should remember that the order of writing notes is never, or typically not, the same as the order in which you use them for writing your text. You read your books in whatever sequence. Sometimes you read the ones you get from the library first, and some are slower in the coming. Or you think that you have the logical order, but then you realize you don't. Or you may just start out with definition texts and then continue on to more specialized texts. And this is almost never the sequence in which you then use your notes for writing. So, what does that mean? Well, you need to be able to sort your notes. If you take down notes in notebooks, you may be hesitant towards tearing out the pages and reshuffle them, but really you should find a format, and most formats for permanent notes these days should be digital, for sorting your notes. And so if you just key them in a word processor or some other computer software without some form of sorting mechanism, then you will have a hard time once you need to sort your notes. Therefore, you should use forms for your notes which can be sorted, either physical index cards, databases, digital ones, or specific note-taking apps. I will be going through one at a later point. So, what goes in your note? Well, there are some essentials for notes, and what you see here on the right is an example of the Cornell style of a note. At the top, you have the title of the book. If you do not put the title in the note, then once you start sorting your notes, you may lose track. Where does this note actually come from? So always make sure that the title is in your note, and keep a list of all the titles and the full bibliographical informations, like author, publisher, and publishing date, in a separate list or note. Second, the bulk of your note will typically be a summary of the parts that you find relevant from the text that you've read. And here it's always a good idea to add a page count. On which pages did the author discuss the stuff that I'm summarizing in this section? Because otherwise, if for some reason you need to get back to a long text like a book, it may be kind of difficult to find out where your summary, which part of the book the summary was actually from. Also, you should put your comments, the reasons why you personally find what was in the book relevant to you, in a separate section. And in the Cornell style of notes, this is typically the bottom of the page, spanning across the entire page, where you would put your own comments and remarks, even questions to yourself. And obviously also, if you do want to quote the author in verbatim, word by word, then you should find a way to make sure for yourself to recognize what you took down for being exactly that, a quotation, a citation, either by adding quotation marks or writing citation. And you should also put the page number. That's very important, because it's a standard in academic texts that whenever you quote an author directly, you should always put the exact page in which the quote was taken from. Finally, you may add information about the relevance for you in terms of your paper. This would typically be like if you work from a synopsis or an outline, say a table of contents for your paper or text. Which section do you think this note is relevant to? So this is, again, thinking about where this note will go, not just where it comes from. So, having said all this, it's obvious that there's a whole number of dilemmas for taking notes. First of all, taking notes takes a lot of time. You get tired, you lose your read flow, etc. And you may get stressed. Oh, am I really going to read all this? And then on top of that, even take notes? An important way to get around this is to sort of change the view that many people have, that notes is something you do on the side. The primary activity in university, many people think, is attending lectures or reading texts. But really, the primary activity should be considered to take notes, because the notes is where all the information, all the knowledge, all the ideas, all the outlines for future writings are held. And not even writing should be considered central. Really, your notes are at the center, and lectures, readings, and writings are all organized around your notes. And once you start thinking about notes like that, you clearly will realize that you need to spend a lot of time with your notes. So don't worry. It's a very well spent time to spend time with your notes. So, another dilemma, of course, is that you may not always know from the start why what you read is relevant. This means that you fear to waste your time. You read something, is this even relevant to me? And if it's not, why would I bother to take notes? And also, you may neglect, and that's the opposite side of the story, what later turns out to be relevant. And obviously, this is a true dilemma, and there is no way of really solving it apart from experience. So if you're new to your subject, be sure that this dilemma will be present. You fear to waste your time because you read stuff that turns out not to be relevant, and you may neglect what later turns out to be relevant. And really, what you should consider here is that, maybe it's not relevant to the paper I'm working on just now, but maybe a year from now or a lifetime from now, this may actually be relevant to me in another context. So unless it's totally off your field, there's a chance that one day it may actually be relevant. But again, yes, sometimes you may never reuse your note. That's just how it is. Further dilemmas. Judging how many notes to take is difficult. And obviously, on the one hand, if you take too many notes, you may lose the overview or essentially just copy the source. If you take notes about every sentence, every paragraph, well, you basically just copied the book, obviously. On the other hand, if you take too few notes, you may lose important points, as just mentioned. Also, judging how detailed notes to take is difficult, because if you take too detailed notes, it takes a lot of time, and really it does, particularly if you first take quick notes and afterwards you sort your notes, so it does take time. And conversely, if you take too concise notes, you may not be able to understand them later, and that's actually a quite typical problem when taking notes. You think that you will know what you mean by simply just taking down keywords or abbreviating sentences or using lots of sort of like pins and dots and say, well, I'll fill the gaps afterwards. Be careful. Unless you build a very specific system for yourself, like a type of shorthand where you know exactly what it means when you leave 3 dots or when you abbreviate words or you make your own sort of symbols, be careful, because chances are even the same evening when you review your notes, or the next day for that matter, you may no longer know what all those signs and scribbles actually meant. So make sure, even if you write in a condensed manner when you take your quick notes, to be sure that they're detailed enough for yourself to understand once you review them. Another dilemma is that one source may be relevant to more of your themes or topics. Obviously, if you have a book, it may have many chapters. Chapters may discuss different aspects of your topic. And in one chapter, the author may say something that is important to your introduction, whereas in another chapter, the author discusses something which may be important to your case studies or whatever. So yes, one source may be relevant to more of your themes or topics. Therefore, you must make separate notes for each theme so that you can sort them into different categories. You may say, well, I just put the title in the first page and then I make a note of several pages and I just, continue my note until I finished the text. That's not a good idea. You should always consider now, are we changing topics here? Should I make a new note so that I can later sort this particular note according to a different topic in my outline or in my synopsis for the text that I'm ultimately going to write. So this is actually also something to take into consideration while taking, and particularly when sorting your notes. So, notes are not just notes. We up until now, discussed the quick notes that you take once you attend a lecture or you read a text. But there are different kinds of notes. The first ones, as already mentioned, should be handwritten, should be condensed, so that they don't take too much time because the lecturer keeps talking or you lose your read flow. But once you've taken them, you should review them and turn them into permanent notes. Permanent notes may move out of your handwritten notepad and into your computer, no problem. And actually, there are many good reasons for doing that. Permanent notes is where you store your literature notes. These are the notes about the literature that you read, with the title of the text, with the summary of what's in the text, with whatever quotations or citations that you want to make, and with your own comments and questions to the text. So these are literature notes. Literature notes must be possible to sort according to your synopsis. And this is where you will make a synopsis note. A synopsis is the outline of the text that you're ultimately going to write. with an introduction, different sections, a conclusion, literature list, etc., as academic texts come. And really, up until this point, this is the only note-taking system that you need for writing just one text. So your quick notes, which you transfer into permanent notes in the form of literature notes and synopsis notes. But once your course is over, you handed in your assignment, and maybe you even got it back. In all likelihood, you will have a new assignment. And therefore, over time, you may want to build so-called ideas notes. You can also do that even for a single paper assignment. It's actually a good idea. Idea notes is taking out the bottom section of the Cornell style note-taking sheet into separate notes. Whenever you get ideas for something, a consideration that stems from your reading or from contemplating over your reading at a later point or from comparing two different texts or something the lecturer said in the auditorium to a text that you read, etc., take those ideas down in ideas notes. Because then your ideas notes over time will form the basis for new synopsis notes, which in turn are linked to new or existing literature notes in your system. And obviously, as a note-taking system like this may rapidly grow to encompass maybe several hundreds, if not thousands of notes, you should, at some point, organize your notes into so-called overview notes. These may be considered as kind of lists of sort of and indexes of different groups of ideas and topics that you've read about, so that you can quickly access whatever is in your notes. Because if you have 4,000 notes in your catalog, figuring out which notes belong together, or you may not be able to remember that. So you make specialized notes to provide yourself with an overview of the different topics and ideas that you keep in your note-taking system. So, in order to organize your notes in a good way, I want to mention two different systems which have been described by two very prolific authors. The one being Umberto Eco, the Italian novelist, and the other being the German sociology thinker Niklas Luhmann. Umberto Eco wrote a book where he defined a note-taking system, which in many ways is similar to Cornell notes, in that it is organized in the form of sections for different types of information, whereas Niklas Luhmann's so-called Zettelkasten, which is German for slip box, or rather index filing cabinet, index card filing cabinets, is more of a note system for life, really, because everything basically is linked. Going over Umberto Eco's system first, as you will remember from the Cornell sheet shown before, Umberto Eco, who described his system in his famous book, The Art of Writing a Thesis, which you can retrieve from your library and which is highly recommendable. He works from a system of always giving the source title, giving a summary, a resume of what is in the text. He singles out quotations, as already described, and he singles out comments. So these different elements belong in different places in his in his index cards, as it is, because Umberto Eco worked in a time where computer systems were not very widely spread, so he used index cards. You can still use index cards. You can still get them in paper supply stores or bookstores. And they're a very handy and convenient format for taking down notes, and particularly you can use them also for index notes. For quick notes while you read and while you go to lectures. So the advantages of Umberto Eco's system is that it's simple. Everything is in one card, so to speak. Obviously, you can do this on a computer, so the card would be imaginary. The disadvantage, however, is that it works best for preconceived texts. Well, you have an assignment, you do a PhD, it's one thing, and then that's it. So it's all good for when you know exactly what, or you have at least a relatively well-defined idea of what is the outcome of your readings. Where is it going? It's going into this paper or this article or this thesis. So that's the pros and cons of Umberto Eco's system. Niklas Luhmann's Zettelkasten, on the other hand, are a bit more specialized in that he works from literature notes, and both Eco and Luhmann have quick notes. So here we're talking about permanent notes. So Niklas Luhmann will work from literature notes, which is like in ecosystem notes where you keep title summaries and quotations, but questions, ideas, remarks will be singled out in individual, separate notes called ideas notes, much like in the diagram before. And ideas notes, when they get too many, as well as literature notes, will be organized by topic in so-called list notes. And from this system, Luhmann, who is really a very prolific writer, having written in his career over 80 books and more than 400 articles, can you imagine, in the span of some 30 years, was able to very quickly shovel his notes around ideas notes, which in turn were linked to literature notes, to build a synopsis, where he would, from which he could very quickly write his text. Niklas Luhmann, like Umberto Eco, worked in a time before computers, and his Zettelkasten system, which ended up comprising, I can't remember, either almost 100,000 or 200,000 individual slips of paper, like sheets of paper with notes on. He kept in a filing cabinet, like the one shown in the image. And they were very meticulously linked by references and sorted in a way that he could very easily get from one note to another. He knew he could figure out exactly where to find which notes. And he would, and that's a very important element of Luhmann's system. He often stressed that he would spend a lot of time in conversation, as he called it, with his Zettelkasten. So he would not just take down the notes and file them, he would also take them out, literally spreading them out on his desktop, and reflect over them, reread them, reorganizing them, in order to get ideas for new synopsis for articles and books that he would then subsequently write. And this again explains how professional scholars really do not consider taking notes as something peripheral, less important than lectures and readings and writings, but really at the center of what they do, whereas everything else is peripheral. Finally, you may say that the pros of Niklas Luhmann's system obviously is that it's a note system for all kinds of reflections, because you may put anything into a note, not just a literature note. You can have ideas from anything, and it can be for any purpose for as long as you live. So it's not just targeted at one particular assignment or doing your thesis. Basically, this is holding track of all information that has come to you from texts, from lectures, from discussions, from observations, all through your professional life, for whatever purpose may turn up tomorrow, next month, next year, or any time in your academic, in the span of your academic career. The cons, obviously, is that it's a more elaborate setup than Umberto Eco's system, and it certainly does require more discipline because you need to spend quite some time linking notes together. However, the good news is that you may start out in an Eco fashion for taking notes for your first assignment, and then you can expand and develop it into a Zettelkasten system over time if you need to, or if you feel like it. So now it's time to give an example. Personally, I work from a system called Obsidian. It's an open source note-taking software for all major platforms, PC, Mac, Linux, but also for tablet and smartphone systems like Android and iOS. And what it does is that it saves notes as individual markdown files. Markdown is a particular file format for formatting texts, bold, italics, etc. And so every single note lives as an individual file in your computer system. But from the Obsidian interface, you can see a list of them. The real treat here is that notes can be linked, they can be backlinked, and they can be tagged. Now, linking is what you know from your browser, from when browsing the internet. You can click on a text and it will take you on to another text. This is very easily done while writing a note. You may link to another note. You may even link to a note which doesn't exist yet, and which you can then bring into existence simply by clicking the link that you just made. And you can tag your notes by means of hashtagging. And this means that your notes know about each other to the extent that they're linked and tagged. And you may, the great advantage of backlinking really is that not only does the note containing the link to the other note know that it's linked to the other note. No, the other note, which you never touched, which you only linked to, will now also know that it is being linked to from that first note. And that is a very useful feature. Also, tagging is powerful because if you build a system of tags for different topics or categories or types or whatever, then Obsidian also offers, and that's what is shown here on the right, a graphic view like a graph, which basically is a diagram showing nodes with lines between them, a graph of all your different nodes and how they're linked together. And this system obviously can be filtered and sorted. This means that you can very easily get an overview of your notes within a particular topic, and you may see how they're interlinked. And you may even color code the dots according to whether the note is a literature note or an ideas note or a list or whatever, or by any other category or tag that you may wish to sort by. So, obviously, this system supports the Zettelkasten note-taking method. It also obviously uses the Eco system, so you can easily start out again using it for the Umberto Eco's system, and then expand it to be used also for the Zettelkasten system later on. obviously, there's some processing here for transferring your handwritten quick notes into notes that live in the Obsidian system. But as already mentioned, this is not time wasted, because reviewing your notes and reflecting over them and maybe develop some ideas notes when you transfer them into the digital format is part of the critical thinking process, which essentially this is all about. So, Obsidian, by the way, can be accessed through online at obsidian.md, MD short for Markdown. And it's an open source and free software. So, now we're closing towards the end of this presentation. Therefore, it's important to take a deep breath and remember ourselves that you write your notes to your future self. Therefore, make sure that they are self-explanatory so that you will understand them in the future. Because whatever you take down a note about may be clear to you at the time of taking the note, but over time you will entertain other topics and time will pass and you will forget, and it's not sure that you will still remember a very a sort of condensed note. And even if it takes time to write a more explanatory note, you should spend the effort, because essentially taking down a note which in the future you will no longer understand basically is a waste of time. So let me conclude. How then do I use my notes? It's important to realize that ideas come from reading, from listening, and from discussing. So when reading, when listening, and when discussing is the time to take your note. However, writing comes from ideas. So without any ideas, you may end up in a writer's block. And if you do not take down your ideas at the time of reading, then they will be difficult to get by. And that's where writer's block becomes a real issue. Also, you must understand that understanding comes from writing. That is, you may write, you obviously write when you take down your notes, so there's some understanding coming there, particularly when transferring your quick notes into your permanent notes, and also from writing down ideas. But there is still some understanding which only comes when you write your final text, because that's where you have to meticulously and in a fulfilling way lay out the concepts that you're discussing and your reflections upon them, your analyses and conclusions. And this is also a stage where understanding may come to you. So don't think that writing is simply a matter of, say, just tapping whatever knowledge is in your note-taking system. It's actually also an integral part of critical thinking. Therefore, make many notes, ideas notes when you read, and link them to their sources, which would be their literature notes, as well as to their destinations, which would be the synopses you make for your different texts. This is quite essential and quite helpful in order to sort of get started once you start writing, which may not be at the end, by the way. You may start writing even when you haven't finished reading yet. So, your idea notes indicate what you can write about. This is also an important point, but because it therefore also indicates what you need to read more about. Obviously, when you build your synopsis and you start linking your ideas notes to your synopsis, then you may have some holes. And then there's really only two things you can do. Either you may rework your synopsis and say, well, originally I intended to have a section about this, but I really haven't read anything about this topic, so what could I possibly write? Maybe I should just reorganize my synopsis and leave it out. Well, that's one way of doing it, of course, but maybe this is an essential part that cannot really be left out. Then the conclusion, of course, is that you need to retrieve more literature on this particular subtopic, which should be addressed in that particular section of your synopsis. And this, ladies and gentlemen, is all I had to tell you about note-taking. Thank you.